Welcome to our distinguished guests, faculty, students, and staff here in Kaufman Theater, and also to everyone joining us through the Internet. I'm Judith Buchanan, Professor of Restorative Dentistry at the University of Minnesota, and I am filling in today for Dr. Deb Olson, who is the Director of Simulation and Exercises for Educational Effectiveness, Preparedness, and Emergency Response Research and Learning Centers, which are commonly more referred to as SEEE PERRC and PERL for the obvious reasons. Dr. Olson has been unfortunately and unexpectedly delayed while traveling abroad, so I am very fortunate to be here in her place. Today's teaching and learning event, From Research to Practice, Connecting Principles of Smart Teaching to Emergency Preparedness and Beyond, is the 7th event in the Teaching and Learning series, an academic health center program designed to foster the scholarship of teaching and learning among those in the health-related professions. Our event today is sponsored by the University of Minnesota Simulation and Exercises for Educational Effectiveness, Preparedness, and Emergency Response Research and Learning Centers, or SEEE PERRC and PERL. That's the last time I'm going to say the full names. So, funded by the Centers for Disease Control, SEEE PERRC conducts applied research to enhance the usefulness of training for performance of the public health preparedness system. The center's goal is to develop a training model that builds system capacity as individuals and groups apply what they have learned to planning for and responding to all public health threats, from natural disasters to foodborne diseases, outbreaks to H1N1. PERRC's sister center, SEEE PERRL, develops and delivers training through various modalities and serves as a resource of translation of the research into education. Both grants are based in the School of Public Health and involve interprofessional collaborators from the Academic Health Center and beyond. Before I continue, I would like to cover a few housekeeping and agenda items. If you have not done so, please put your mobile phones on silent. Our agenda for today will proceed in the following format. We will hear from our guest speaker, Dr. Ambrose. Then following her presentation, there will be a 3 or 4 minute pause while we reset the stage to accommodate our panel discussion. During this time, I will encourage you to submit questions. You should have received an index card when you arrived, and if anybody needs an additional index card, please raise your hand and we'll make sure that you'll have that card available. Program staff will pick those up at the appropriate time. Today's presentation is also being broadcast as a live webinar, and if you are joining us via the internet, you can also submit questions. To do so, please click on the balloon icon at the top left of your screen. As I mentioned, following Dr. Ambrose's presentation, we will hear briefly from today's panelists, who will discuss how smart teaching principles play out in real teaching and learning context. Following our panel's presentation, we will take questions from the audience here in the theater and those of you that are joining us online. We look forward to some very thought-provoking questions and some very interesting discussions. Now, I'm delighted to tell you about our highlighted speaker. We are honored to have Dr. Susan Ambrose with us today. Dr. Ambrose is Professor of Education and the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning at Northeastern University in Boston. She earned her Doctorate of Arts in History from Carnegie Mellon University and served as Associate Provost for Education, Director of the Eberly Center for Teaching Excellence, and as a teaching professor in the Department of History at Carnegie Mellon before joining Northeastern in August of 2012. She's barely had a chance to get used to her new environment, so thank you for taking time out of your schedule to be with us today. She is an internationally recognized expert on college-level teaching and learning. She's the co-author of 4 books. Her most recent book, How Learning Works, 7 Research-Based Principles for Smart Teaching, has been widely praised for integrating fundamental research in the cognitive sciences with practical application. I hadn't had a chance to look at the book, so I spent some time on the internet reviewing comments about the book, and let me tell you, the reviews were indeed impressive. One dean said that after he read the book, he ordered the book for every single faculty member at his college. So I'm very much looking forward to buying the book today and, of course, hearing more about her research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ambrose to the stage.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here. I'm showing my new university logo. I'm getting used to it, the colors and the logo. It's really nice to be here to talk about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and that's learning. And I was particularly interested when the invitation came because I have to choose very carefully, given my time, where to go. And I was interested because of the work that was going on here. Not only did I find it just cool, but also the emphasis on moving research into practice, because that's a lot of what I've spent my career doing, is trying to understand a lot of the research that's done from a variety of different areas, disciplines that impact learning, and then sharing that research with faculty who are incredibly busy and don't have the time to read the research on their own. So making that connection was very important to me. And so there's a real synergy between what I do and what's being done in the work here. So what I'm going to do very briefly is set the context for what a lot of people would call learner-centered teaching, and then very briefly share with you the 7 principles of learning that I've culled with my colleagues out over many, many years that I hope you will find interesting and intriguing. For those of you who teach, especially really good teachers, often this serves as a way of understanding at a deeper level why what you do works. There are many really effective teachers who, through trial and error, have figured out what works in terms of learning. But often when they see the principles, truly understand at that deep level why. And for those of you who may be new to teaching or newer to teaching, there's no reason sometimes to have to go through all the trial and error that those of us who didn't have access to this have gone through in our careers. So I'm going to briefly present those principles to you, and then afterwards, you heard the agenda, some of the researchers are going to connect their current work in emergency preparedness to some of these principles. The objectives for the session, well, they're modest. I hope that by the end of the session you'll be interested enough in one of the principles that you've heard about that resonate with you, that you might want to read a little bit more about it, understand it at a deeper level, and that you really will see the connection to some real work that's going on here. So the context. As I said, these principles are grounded in the research literature that comes from what now is broadly called the learning sciences, cognitive psychology, social psychology, educational research, educational and cultural anthropology, organizational behavior, industrial psychology, people who study organizations and people within them. So it really has drawn very broadly from a lot of the research across disciplines and domains. And we have shared and worked with faculty over, I have almost 30 years now, and really worked with people not only across disciplines, but across groups, across cohorts from undergraduate through graduate students, and across cultures. While there are very different ways that education manifests itself in a variety of different institutions, I've worked with these principles with people from Latin America, from Mexico and Chile, all the way through to Korea and India and Taiwan and Singapore. And the truth is that a learner is a learner anywhere. The way people process information is the way people process information. And there are some cultural differences, but not at the most deep level. And the most important thing for me about these principles is that they really are generative. They're not strategies or tips for teaching, because strategies and tips for teaching often don't apply across contexts. And in fact, these principles do. So I think that for those of us who really always aspire to be better as teachers, it's really important that we understand at a fundamental level how learning actually works, so that we can adapt the principles to the appropriate context, to the context that we find ourselves in. The learning-centered approach, this is very different from talking about teaching first. It's really talking about learning first and then designing your teaching, the courses, the educational experiences as a result of understanding learning. Really comes from what we all know, and that's that learning happens in the minds of the learners. And that the only way we can influence learning is by influencing the behaviors that students engage in, by creating the conditions that our students find themselves in. And so it's really important, if we're going to influence students and create those conditions, that we understand them as learners, as the really complex social, emotional, intellectual beings that they are. And so these two quotes for me really do capture this notion that learning happens in the minds of the learners, and as teachers we need to understand who they are at a very deep level so we can create those conditions or that context. When we think about learners, we need to really understand that everything they bring with them at all levels, everything they bring with them, the knowledge, both formal and informal, their life experience, their values, their attitudes, their beliefs, all of that does impact learning. It impacts how they interpret information, how they organize it. It impacts their expectations for how they're going to use it. And when I'm talking about learning, I'm really talking about students really owning the information that becomes knowledge because they can use it flexibly in a variety of different contexts. And that's what learning is all about. When we're teaching our students, we don't want them, nor do we believe that it will be helpful for them to be able to map directly from one situation to the same situation in the real world. That just doesn't happen. So unless you can take your skills, your abilities, the knowledge you have, and use it flexibly in a variety of different contexts, then it's really not going to be very helpful for you. And so that's how I'm thinking about learning as we talk about it. And for those of you who are dealing with, I'm going to call adult learners now, and I'm going to differentiate, even though 18 to 22-year-olds are adults and we think about them as adults, I'm really talking about people who are returning professionals, simply to say that the principles of learning apply to them as well. I told you they apply across all contexts, but there are particular aspects or characteristics that adult learners bring with them. And it's important that we understand that. So one of the things I said a minute ago is that everything the learner brings with them impacts how they take in information, organize it, and whether they're able to retrieve it down the road and use it. And the thing about adult learners is they have even more of that prior knowledge. They have very complex identities, often as professionals, as husbands or wives, parents or grandparents, etc., personal histories, and very unique living contexts because they have been involved in a variety of different areas. And so it's important that we contextualize the kind of learners that we're talking about with the PERCs and the PERLs, who really are adult learners, who bring on top of those principles a whole lot of other things with them. And I always, as I age, I think this is really good news, and maybe that's why it's in here today, to make me feel better, but that there is a lot of evidence that the brains of adults continue to produce new neurons for cognition, and that the more you exercise, you're in stimulated environments, continual learning does appear to be able to increase the cell growth and connections throughout your life. So the point of that is that we can all continue to learn. People used to talk about, you know, the old adage, can you teach an old dog new tricks? And I think a lot of the research says, in fact, you can. So what I'm really talking about today and focusing on the learning principles from which people can design curriculum, courses, educational experiences, I'm really talking about a shift from thinking about how we teach to really thinking about how people learn. And for most of us as faculty, the focus has always been on us as teachers, not as students, as learners. So there are 7 principles. I'm going to just very briefly talk about each of those, but I wanted you to see them as a group. They all interact. People often will ask which of these is the most important. I would be very hard-pressed to answer that question because they all interrelate. The first of those principles has to do with prior knowledge, and I already, in some respects, introduced that by saying that everything the learner brings with them has an impact on learning. Think of prior knowledge as the lens through which all new information comes. And so the good news is that people bring a lot of prior knowledge with them. Again, formal, informal, attitudes, beliefs, abilities, not just information. I mean knowledge very broadly. And when that knowledge is accurate, appropriate, sufficient, and activated, learning happens. So that's the good news. The bad news is that oftentimes people bring with them some knowledge that may be inaccurate, that may be inappropriate, that may be insufficient, or that may be inactive. And when that happens, it can actually impede learning. Now, most of us who teach find it relatively easy to identify inaccurate information. In most of our disciplines, there are just common misconceptions that students come in with. And so that is relatively easy for people who've taught a few times, the same course a few times, to recognize. But the others are really kind of interesting, and I don't think we've thought about them as much. Inappropriate knowledge means that students might have some knowledge that they use in certain contexts that actually is appropriate, but when they take it and try to use it in another context, it may be inappropriate. So, for example, if learners are experienced in creative, expressive writing, and they do that very well, and then they're asked to write a policy memo or a lab report using the knowledge and the experience they have as creative writers or expressive writers, would be inappropriate in a policy memo or in a lab report. And so that's an example of inappropriate knowledge. And then there's insufficient knowledge. And one of the things that we often don't think about is the different kinds of knowledge that students bring with them. There are people who often talk about 3 kinds of knowledge. Declarative knowledge, which is kind of a factual, being able to provide a definition. Procedural knowledge, which is being able to actually do something. And then contextual knowledge, which is knowing when to use something. And so you may be able to define Ohm's law, but do you know how to use it? And you may be able to define it and use it, but do you know when to use it? Think about your own disciplines and similar examples. Well, insufficient knowledge may be, I've heard of something, I recognize it, and I may even be able to explain it, but I don't know when to use it. And so if I don't know when to use it, the knowledge isn't sufficient. I need more of that kind of knowledge. And so often, for those of you who teach, sometimes we ask students, how many of you know X, Y, or Z by show of hands? It's common sometimes whenever you're moving into a new part of a course. How many of you know whatever by show of hands? And students put up their hands. And often when we as the faculty say no, what we mean is you know it, you can use it flexibly in a variety of different contexts. And what students or other learners may interpret that as, I heard it once, I read it in a textbook, it sort of kind of sounds familiar. And so we often don't define what no actually means, and we don't think about the fact that for some people no could be just a level of awareness. I've heard of it. For others it could be, yeah, I know how to use it if you tell me when to use it. And what we really mean often as faculty is all of those things. And then finally there's inactive knowledge. Inactive knowledge is knowledge that somebody has, but it's not activated, so they're not using it. And part of the issue around inactive knowledge is that we know transfer is a very sophisticated, complex intellectual task. And so teaching learners something and then expecting they will know when to use it, how to transfer it, I think is a common mistake a lot of us make. And so it's not unusual that students will learn something in foundational courses that is supposed to build as they move into higher level courses, but you know, the frustration in higher level courses is they must not have learned anything in the foundational. And often it's not that they haven't learned anything, it's that that knowledge isn't being activated. And so that's just a very brief, I was going to say diatribe, it's just a sense of how prior knowledge can impact learning. And it sort of begs the question, once you identify what kind of prior knowledge students have that's getting in the way, what do you do about it? And of course, that's a conversation for another time. But the first rule for us as faculty members is to simply understand that students really don't come in as blank slates, that they have a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience, and that they're going to build on that one way or another. And so you want to make sure that what they're building on is accurate, is sufficient, is appropriate. And that when you're dealing with adult students, you have to remember that the amount of information, knowledge, prior experience is much larger. And so because it's much larger, you really want to make sure that people are activating, using what it is they know, and that what they know is appropriate and accurate. Okay, so that's the first, prior knowledge. Now, the second principle that I want to briefly talk about is organization. Because what we know about experts is experts aren't experts just because they have a whole bunch of knowledge. Experts are experts because they've organized that knowledge in a way that they can actually retrieve and use it. Experts have what we often refer to as rich, meaningful knowledge structures. Whereas novices, and here I want to use the word novice because you can have a graduate student coming into a course that's new to them as a novice. You can have an adult returning professional coming into an educational experience in which they're new, and so they're a novice. And novices who are new to any kind of learning situation often will make connections because that's what we do as human beings, but those connections can often be sparse, superficial, and they don't serve the students very well. And as experts, the other thing we know about experts is that even though we carry around all of these organizational structures in our mind, they're not explicit because we're experts. That the more expert you become, the more a lot of things that early on you were very careful to know, understand, delineate, really become all mushed together. And so we know that experts, for example, in a lot of things that they do, tend to skip and combine steps. And so if you're trying to help students organize information in a way that's going to allow them to retrieve it later on, to take new information and connect it to that organization, you need to be aware of your own organizational structure. And that's something that as experts, many of us just don't think about on a daily basis. So here's an example of novice versus expert, that oftentimes you will have novices either connect the dots, if you will, in, again, kind of superficial ways. And for those of you who have taught undergraduates, for example, you may look at A and you may recognize that sometimes students may connect by what happened on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in your course. And they see those as separate, not connected. Or they may connect in a course that's more science-based, lecture, lab, and recitation. And they see them as separate, not connected. And that's problematic because all of what it is we're teaching is connected in one way or another, And often when we're lecturing or when students are in different components of that course, they're not seeing it. Or they may represent things in a very linear way, which may be appropriate like B for some courses, for some bodies of information, but isn't as rich and meaningful a structure that's going to allow them to be able to retrieve information down the road. I teach history, and so students often think of history as just time-based. And so something happened, in 1900, then 1930, and 1950, and 1970. Well, that's not the only way to understand history, and in fact, that's a very simplified way to understand history. As opposed to experts who have a variety of different organizational structures in mind that really allow them to pull out information whenever they need that information. And those are examples in C and D. I often say that, when I'm in a science engineering context, people are often comfortable with C and wonder what D is. And I often say D is actually a discipline like mine, a discipline like history, where we're connecting names and dates and themes and patterns and places and people. And so it's not represented as well by C as it is by D. And that may look sloppy to people, but that organizational representation allows people to pull information out in a connected way and use it. And it also allows people to situate information when new information comes in. Because that's the key to organization. That is, lifelong learners, we will always be taking in new information. And if we have any chance of being able to remember and use that information, it's got to be connected appropriately. All right, so that's prior knowledge and organization, which are very closely connected. But the issue for any kind of learner, whether it's an adult learner or a young child, is motivation. And it's not motivation in the common way that sometimes we think about motivation. And that is when I talk with colleagues around the country, really, people think motivation means, jumping up and down, being a really good actor, knowing what music and movies the students are listening to. And that's really not what motivation is all about. While that may be motivating in some respects to some students if you can use it appropriately, motivation really has more to do with expectations and the value or the relevancy that students place on what it is they're about to learn or they're learning. And the most important thing about motivation is that it really does lead to behavior or not, if students aren't motivated, that supports learning and performance. So in terms of expectation and value, students are more likely to engage in behaviors that will help them to learn if they expect to be successful and if they believe that there is a relevancy to what it is they're learning. And so the value, relevancy, and expectation are really important. And I think this becomes increasingly important when we look at a lot of what's going on today in education in the U.S., especially around things like math and science. There's a big concern that we're not as competitive in math and science, and so any of the fields in which students are going to go into and where they need a foundation in math and science, we're either not keeping students or we're not getting them to begin with. And some of the research would indicate that the issue there has to do with expectancy, whether or not people believe they can be successful. So, for example, you've probably heard a lot in the common press about math and young girls and mathematics. And this notion that some people have, although the research is across a variety of fields, but that if students believe or if learners believe that intelligence is fixed, that you either have that math gene or not. And if you've never been good in math and you don't believe you have the math gene, then guess what happens in terms of behavior? You don't engage in the behaviors that you need to engage in to learn. So if I believe I've always been a C student when it comes to math, I just don't have that math gene, I will not do extra problems, I will not seek help, I will not join a study group, I will not go talk to the professor, because my expectation is no matter what I do, I'm never going to be good in math. And so that expectancy impacts the behavior, which impacts learning and performance. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy versus someone who believes that intelligence is malleable, that the more I study, the more I learn, the more questions I ask, the better I will get at something. Those students, those learners will then engage in behaviors they will ask questions, they will do extra problems, they will seek help that lead to learning and performance. And so it's really important that we understand that in everything we do, we have to think about issues of expectancy and value. And what we have to remember is that motivation really is all about perception. It's what I believe and what I perceive. And beliefs and perceptions, in some respects, are very difficult to get at. In other respects, they're the key to everything else I'm going to talk about. Because if students don't believe they can be successful, they're not going to engage in the behaviors. Helping them to gain the knowledge and organize it effectively is going to be sort of a moot point. And when it comes to adult learners, these things are just as important. They play, in fact, even more so in terms of value, because adult learners are highly pragmatic. No matter what kind of situation adult learners are coming into, they're usually coming in because there's something they need to know. And so we would call them highly motivated students, but that means that we better really be able to show the relevance or the value, because that's really what they're looking for, is the relevance or the value to how it's going to impact their life immediately. The issue that I mentioned before is that all of these principles really do play themselves out across cultures, but there are different manifestations. The way they play them out may be different depending on the culture. And I wanted to just share one example because it was, something that I was just talking about, and this is just one study, but this notion of how much of intelligence is due to natural ability and how much to effort. And in this particular study, when they asked about natural ability or effort, what they found was European Americans tended to think about it very differently than Asian Americans. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the research on why students do better on some of the international exams in math and science, and then you compare that to how many hours their students in other countries spend in school, time on task, something that teachers have been talking about for a very long time, then it's easy to understand a lot of this, that in a lot of countries they believe the more time you spend devoted to something, the more you will master it, and in fact, that's what happens. So we need to think about cultural diversity, cultural background, and actually this is about kind of nationality, but when I think culture, I think disciplinary as well, because cultures have very different disciplines. So for those of you that teach in graduate programs where you're getting students who may be from engineering, from the humanities, from the sciences, from the social sciences, from the policy aspects, they not only have, those students, different knowledge bases and skill sets, but they also have different cultural backgrounds. There is, each discipline has culture, which is a set of beliefs and norms and values and the way things play out. And it's important that we understand all of that when we think about motivation, particularly expectancy and value. All right. The fourth principle I always say is a no-brainer, because I've never met a faculty member anywhere in the world, or a teacher for that matter, that doesn't believe practice and feedback are important, and that doesn't believe that the two of those go together. I think there are two things that I want to say about this. The first is that practice and feedback has to always be directed toward goals. And it's really important that we put goals at the center of all of this. And there, again, I don't know a faculty member that I've ever met that when they're designing a course or an educational experience don't have goals in mind. But what we know is from the expert-novice differences that often experts aren't as explicit, and so faculty sometimes aren't as explicit in what the goal or the expected outcome is. And that people learn more when they know what it is they're expected to be able to do at the end of a learning experience, because if they know that, they can monitor their understanding, they can monitor their performance, their progress, and then they can take action if need be. So goals really need to be at the center of the practice, the performance, and the feedback. As I said, I've never met anyone who argued against that. The most important issue for those of us who are educators is there are only so many hours in a day. And so how can we give students the amount of feedback they really need to master something at whatever level we're expecting mastery? And then the more practice we give them, the more feedback we also have to provide, because practice without feedback just doesn't work. Practice without feedback, and a lot of us have ourselves done this, or we have children who are involved in sports or music, and it's just very obvious there that if you continue to practice in the wrong way, you may get hurt if it's sports, or you may not progress, and so that feedback is incredibly important. So the question around practice and feedback always has to do with efficiency. How can we give them the practice they need and give them the feedback while being efficient, because learners' time is very precious, as is teachers' time, and learners' time is even more precious when you're dealing with adult returning professionals who have jobs and families. And so it's very important that we make sure we target the kind of practice to give students what it is they need. From a neuroscientific viewpoint, it was shared with me by a neuroscientist, this notion of the reason we need practice and feedback is that what we're really trying to do at that level is to change existing neural networks. And so the repetition, the practice, and the time is all important in that. And that sometimes we have expectations which just don't play themselves out. If you've got a 15-week semester, there is only so much you're going to do in 15 weeks. And in fact, many of us who have taught, and I won't ask for a show of hands, but those of you watching it could show your hands and no one would know. Many of us have designed courses that just had way too much in it. I think anyone who's ever taught has made that mistake at least a few times. And this notion of, if you think about really what it is you want to happen, it really does happen. When we say in the minds of the learner, we mean in the brains of the learner, and what needs to happen there is really quite complex. And so this notion of the more practice and the more feedback, the better, is really incredibly important. Now, when we talk about practice and feedback, we're always talking about practice toward mastery. And it may be mastery with a little m, mastering what's in our courses or what's in a particular unit, or it may be mastery with a big M, which is eventually becoming an expert. But what we know about mastery, and again, what we tend to forget as experts, as educators, as faculty, is how we learned things, because now things come so easily to us. Part of the issue around mastery or expertise is automaticity, that a lot of the things that will take novices a lot of time and energy don't take any time and energy for experts, because it becomes automatic. And so the whole issue of mastery, the way we all learned what we learned, whether it's our domain or whether it's something like driving or playing an instrument or playing a sport, is that first you acquire those component skills, by which I mean knowledge as well as intellectual skills, ability. And you acquire those skills, and then you work at learning how to integrate them. And then once you integrate those skills, you work at understanding how you apply them, how you transfer them across domains. And for all of you who have driven, since that seems to be something that a lot of people have in common, if you think about how you learn to drive, all of the different component parts that you learn, right? How to adjust the mirrors, turn on the ignition, if you're using a stick shift, how to balance the two pedals, how to look in your rearview mirror, know what's going around you, use the horn, et cetera, et cetera. You learn those as component parts, and then you learn how to do them all at the same time. But we all know, in terms of when to apply, that the way you use your brake is different if you're driving on a clear sunny day, in the rain, or in the snow, right? And so expertise is all of these things. And when we think about practice, we know that it's important sometimes for students to practice the component skills so that they become automatic, and they're able to integrate them and then learn how to apply them. So, you know, we would think about something as common as learning the multiplication tables. Most of us had to do that. I'm assuming they still do that in schools today. That's a component skill. You learn to be very quick with it. It's automatic, so that it's not going to take a lot of cognitive load whenever you now get in a situation where you're doing differential equations. And so this issue of mastery really has to do with thinking about all of the pieces of learning that go into whatever it is you're asking students to do. And the reason this is difficult, as I said, for faculty or for educators, and the reason thinking about learning as you design courses and educational experiences is that we as faculty members are often on the far end of the spectrum at a state that's called unconscious competence. There are some people who would call this expert blind spot, that the more expert you become, the more you don't think about things, you do them automatically, the harder it is to explain something in all of its complexity with all of those steps. And so unconscious competence means we have a lot of competence, we just don't think about it, and if you're not thinking about it, are you explaining it? As opposed to any learner in a brand new situation, and this could be, you know, me at age 50 learning how to play the piano. I would come in at a state of unconscious incompetence if it's something that's brand new to me. And this means I don't know what I don't know. And when you don't know what you don't know, you can't ask questions. And so in any new learning situation, the most important aspect of the learning situation is moving from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence. Because when you know what you don't know, you can ask questions. And then what we hope is that the learner comes to the next state, which is conscious competence, which means they know how to do something. It takes a lot of time, a lot of energy. And as you move toward expertise, things will take less time and less energy as that automaticity kind of fills in. And so one of the things that's interesting here, depending on who your students are, how new they are to whatever it is you're teaching, is that both you and the students can be at an unconscious state for different reasons. And we have to resolve that by moving students up enough so they can ask questions, but by us coming down enough that we remember consciously the things that it takes in order to do something or learn something that we're asking students to do or to learn. All right. So as we think about the student as learner, we're talking about the knowledge they come in with, the organization, why and how that's important. We're talking about the issues of motivating them to want to learn and helping them develop mastery by providing the right kind of practice and feedback. But the other thing we need to remember is that our students aren't only intellectual beings, they're also social emotional beings. And so the students who are 18 to 22-year-olds have a different set of issues than people who are adult returning professionals, but all of them do have lives outside of the classroom or outside of the educational experience. And it's important that we simply remember that because we're teaching students, we're not just teaching content. And so it's important that we contextualize our student in that larger context, because everything that's going on in their lives is going to have an impact, whether we like it or not, on their learning. And when it comes to adult learners, I think it becomes actually a lot more complex. The thing about adult learners is that often adult learners in their daily lives are in control. They're a professional, they've got a job, they have kids. Although, if like me, you've lived through the teenage years, you often didn't feel like you were in control. But most adults feel like they have some semblance of control over their lives. And then when they come into a situation where they're actually new to the situation, a lot of things can happen. And so it's important that we remember that confidence and competence are really mutually enhancing. And that for adults, well, for anyone, the more confident you become in trying or doing something, the more competent you'll become. And then when you become more competent, you feel confidence to learn more and more. And so it's really important that for adults we tap into those issues of confidence and competence, because they can come in as competent professionals learning something new and may not have the confidence. And so it's important to remember that. I said before that adult learners are very pragmatic. They want to know that what they're learning is relevant immediately to their lives. And sometimes it's because of how complex their lives are. They've got a job, they've got a family, and they're doing this in order to enhance their skill set, their knowledge base, in order to be able to continue to progress in their profession or maybe switch professions. And so there's all these things going on, and they can't afford not to be pragmatic. But the other thing is that it can be really disconcerting to come in and face something brand new when you feel like you're competent and realize that you're not competent in a particular area. And so it's really important, if we're teaching adult students, that we think about them as carefully as we think about 18 to 22-year-olds, but who have a very different set of unique characteristics. The issue of culture, and again, some of the examples here are culture based on nationality or ethnic group, but when I think about culture, I really think about disciplinary culture too. But it's really important that we think about who these students are as not just intellectual beings, but, if you will, as cultural beings, and recognize that who they are, where they come from, what their experience is, might actually impact the behaviors they have. And we said before, when you looked at the motivation slide, that their behaviors then impact learning and performance. And so it's really important to think about things like what the role of the professor is as an expert when you're teaching adult students in particular, because it varies across cultures. In the United States, there's a lot more informality in learning situations, teaching situations, than there are in other countries. And that formality in other countries might really lead students of any age, really, but not to ask questions. So in some countries, if a faculty member, if an educator explains something to students and students don't understand, they would never ask a question, because to ask a question of clarity would imply that the teacher didn't do a good job giving the explanation. And so, students may not ask questions, whereas questions are how we know where students are and how they're thinking. And so questions are really important. Learning from teacher versus learning from peers. There are cultures in which people strongly believe that the best learning happens from peers, and there are other cultures where we believe that's teacher as expert model, and that, the teacher has all the knowledge, and what it is they're supposed to do is share that knowledge with students. And so you just want to think about, as all of our populations of learners, whether they're undergraduates, graduate students, or adult returning professionals, the numbers are increasing in terms of the variety that we have within all of our educational institutions and situations. And so culture does become an issue as you think about the way it dictates behavior and how those behaviors might add to or take away from learning. And then finally, and I think when we think about adult learners, this is kind of the best news, if you will. Finally, what a lot of us think about in undergraduate education, which differs from thinking about adult returning professionals, is that we want students to become what we call here self-directed learning. But it also is often referred to as metacognition, kind of learning how to learn, because we want to send people out into the world that is changing so rapidly in a state in which they continue to learn. And so this is, in essence, a kind of how does one continue to learn, and it's driven at the center by students' or learners' beliefs about intelligence and learning, but it really is a very generic model, that when you're given something new to do, you take time to assess what you're asked to do, that you evaluate the strengths and weaknesses you have, and that you compensate for those areas where you can't do something or you're missing pieces of information or a skill set, that you plan very carefully, that you implement the plan, but you continually monitor so that if the plan isn't working, you adjust as needed. And what's interesting about this is that the research tells us for 18 to 22-year-olds, or for novices, if you will, none of this happens on a routine basis. That often you give students an assignment, they immediately begin to answer the assignment, to deal with the problem, to write their essay, whatever. They don't do what experts do. Experts spend a huge amount of time just qualitatively thinking through whatever task they're giving without even recognizing it. Spend a lot of time dissecting what it is they need to do, planning, thinking about what it will look like in the end, and that 18 to 22-year-olds don't do that. That's bad news for those who teach undergraduates. The good news is that adults, most adults really do have these metacognitive skills. They have learned as a result of life how important it is when you have to do something to think about it in advance, how you're going to use your time judiciously, what it is you know and don't know. For a lot of adults, that comes across in their daily lives. And so that's an important thing to know and to tap into, and an advantage we have for those of us who teach adult returning professionals. They already possess those metacognitive skills, and in a lot of respects, that makes our lives much easier. So, while that may seem a bit overwhelming, it is 7 principles, and a lot of the psychological research would tell us that people can hold in short-term memory 7 plus or minus 2 chunks. So it would be interesting as you walk out today to see how many of the 7 you might remember if you've held those in short-term memory. But I hope you have a sense that this is manageable. I'm sure a lot of you have, if you're teaching, connected to a lot of these things that you just learned on your own by experience, but that maybe they now make more sense to you. And that all of these things interrelate. That it's important to be able to know who your students are as learners, but to remember that they're also social, emotional beings as you try to motivate them, as you try to help them take new information and organize it in a way that they both can master it and retrieve it down the road. Because, again, that's really what learning is all about. So that is an overview of a set of principles. And the next part of the program is really to think about, to have some experts who are dealing with the PERCs and the PERLs really talk about how this can play out in some of the exciting and interesting work that they're doing.
The panelists who have joined me on stage are all conducting research in emergency preparedness. All of them serve as lead investigators or key personnel in SEEE PERRC projects. They've spent the last 4 years researching efficient and effective methods of training emergency preparedness professionals. So I'm going to introduce them all now at this time. First, we have Dr. William Riley, who's the lead investigator of creating high reliability teams for public health preparedness. He serves as Associate Dean for Student Affairs in the School of Public Health here at the University of Minnesota, and is also an Associate Professor in Health Policy and Management. Next is Cheryl Peterson Kroeber, the Deputy Director of the Office of Emergency Preparedness in the Minnesota Department of Health. She's been working closely on the Creating High Reliability Teams for Public Health Preparedness project. The study site is the Department Operations Center at the University Department of Health. She also serves as a preceptor for the effectiveness of simulated disaster response scenario projects led by Jane Miller, who I will talk about in a minute, but unfortunately she will not be able to be with us today. Dr. Craig Hedberg is the lead investigator of the retrospective cohort study of responders training and system performance project. He is an associate professor in the environmental health sciences in the School of Public Health at the University of Minnesota. Dr. Colleen Monahan is the lead investigator of using collaborative virtual environments in preparedness and emergency response planning project. She is the founder and director of the Center for the Advancement of Distant Education, located at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Monahan is also adjunct assistant professor in the Division of Community Health Sciences at the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Jane Miller was not able to be with us, so we're very fortunate to have Joan Rombic, who is from the AHC Office of Emergency Response. She is a co-investigator of the effectiveness of simulated disaster response scenarios. And then, of course, we have Dr. Susan Ambrose, who has so graciously agreed to be part of our panel. Now, when Dr. Ambrose concluded her presentation just a few minutes ago, she left us with a provocative question. How do principles play out in real teaching and learning contexts, such as the ones created and implemented by those involved in emergency preparedness? We are going to ask our panelists to answer this question one by one. So we'll start with Bill Riley. Bill, would you want to take an opportunity to address that for us?
Thank you very much, Judy. And actually, Cheryl and I are partners along with Nikki Scullard, and Cheryl has the practical approach. So she's going to talk about the practical, then I'll talk about the research aspects.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Again, our project at the Minnesota Department of Health, we're a subrecipient working with Bill Riley. At the department, what we are trying to do, and it's been fascinating to listen to Dr. Ambrose again this morning after looking at some of her work, we are working on incorporating our Department Operations Center and finding research to back the way that we've approached teaching the staff at the department. We do have all returning adult learners, so we do have many challenges that I think are unique. We have very highly educated staff at the department, and many of them are experts in their field. So we are taking people who are experts in a certain subject matter and making them now trying to increase their knowledge base about response and being a responder. A Department Operations Center is where people come together and kind of oversee all the functions of the health department in supporting response at a local level or at a state level. What we really found is that we took these professionals and threw them into a new setting, kind of forcing them, in essence, to change their knowledge base. We found many people who are excellent leaders in their field who really were uncomfortable with the positions that we had put them into. And our findings really reaffirm what Dr. Ambrose shared, in that we wanted people to obtain new skills, but we often had not made the environment comfortable for them. So traditionally at the department, before we received this research grant, we had conducted a couple, 3, maybe 4 exercises a year where people came into the Operations Center and performed these functions. By participating in the grant, we were able to pull these teams together, and we ended up having 3 teams who exercised, it was at least 10 times each year in a formal setting in the Operations Center, besides additional learning that they received. So we really increased that. That by itself increased their comfort level in what we were asking them to do. And that, as Dr. Ambrose shared, then allows them to ask more questions. Originally, when we brought people in, they were afraid to ask questions because it was something they didn't know much about, and they were very smart people. And again, it's that comfort level that we needed to create. The repetition allowed them to overcome those weaknesses and truly believe that they could do what we were asking them to do. It allowed them to build on their strengths and then to create new plans to continue their learning. We engaged the teams by bringing in small learnings about the department, about response, into each of the exercises as well. So as they were responding and we were creating scenarios about certain subjects, we would bring in a subject matter expert from another division in the department or area and teach them something, for example, about the strategic national stockpile. If the scenario they were exercising, that was something that they were going to need to learn about and incorporate into the response. So we felt like we gave them more and more opportunities to increase their knowledge. We took the feedback from the teams, and again, this was critical in taking their feedback as the people participating and weaving that into our improvement planning as the educators or teachers of what we wanted them to do. So that was a way then that when they came in the next time, we acknowledged that we had taken their input to improve our process. And that again then empowered them all the more to re-engage and ask us more questions, make suggestions for improvement. Because again, when we're bringing in adult learners, it's a two-way street, I believe. We also provided orientations. We came to realize that while those of us in preparedness are extremely comfortable in our operations center, the coming into a different room that's kind of created for emergencies, for some people that caused angst all by itself. So we had to change that environment and bring people in prior to beginning or initiating a simulation or exercise, get them comfortable with the room, let them play around with their computers, find documents, all those sorts of things, not in the kind of classroom setting or response setting, and that allowed them, again, greater comfort. We continually have adapted our process. We now, looking forward with the end of the grant, are trying to find how we're going to be able to continue the volume of repetition that we were able to do through the grant. It's one of those things that with learning, again, it's the practice concept that Dr. Ambrose referenced. The more you do it, the more comfortable you get, the more comfortable you are asking your peers questions, you're asking the mentors or coaches. We provided coaches as well, which was a new step for us. And again, it really allowed them to improve their response capability and capacity for us as an agency. I guess in kind of closing mine up and passing it back to Bill, I guess the most important thing is that this research does affirm the efforts that we've done in partnership with the university, and it really gives people more time on task. I thought that was fascinating as well, that concept. So to me it was nice to affirm that we were on the right track, that our research does fit with other research, that we are continuing to grow, and hopefully we'll be able to share this with other people around the country.
Cheryl, thank you. Cheryl and I thought that it would be more relevant for you, for Cheryl, to discuss the practical aspects of the project that we undertook, and I will focus on the research and the theoretical aspects. Susan summarized beautifully all the concepts and the principles of learning that we incorporated into what we call in situ simulation. And I wrote furiously during all of your presentation, and I changed this 7 different times while you were speaking. So what I will do is just touch on a couple points. One is in safety critical industries, which is where we developed our learning methodology. Rather than a teaching methodology, we think of it as a learning methodology because we don't teach it all, with the exception of some of the content. And it presupposes that when you bring experts together, they are going to behave expertly. And we know from all of our research in other settings and at the Health Department Operations Center that when you bring experts together, they do not behave as an expert team. So point number 1 is that a team of experts is not an expert team. So if we're looking at high reliability, how do we ensure that our teams, and how do we train our teams so that they behave as an expert team? We identified 4 distinct behaviors over several years of research in this, and those are situational awareness, a shared mental model, closed loop communication, and what we call SBAR communication. And as we conducted our research and underwent the training that Cheryl described, we found different components during a simulation, and that the types of behaviors that we see in different phases of a Department Operations Center change according to what phase that the simulation, or in our case, the emergency is going through. So the model that we've developed is that if we want our teams in Department Operations Center, and this would certainly hold true for other types of emergency settings. It's a function of the technical skills. We need the technical experts and expertise, but we also need non-technical skill expertise, and we need well-designed processes. And the approach that we developed, which we call insight to simulation, is putting experts in a situation that stresses them tremendously. And the reason we stress it is so that it pushes them to behaviors that they might not otherwise perform during a regular exercise. That's one point. But also it pushes them to behaviors that they will need to be able to perform, because all the catastrophic events that we see in safety critical industries occur when people go beyond their area of comfort that Susan was describing. So each of the research projects that are represented in the discussion today are using different simulation strategies, and they're all important strategies, they're all good strategy. Our insight to simulation strategy is putting experts into a situation where they would normally perform, and that's why we call it insight to. It's not in a learning lab, and it's not a tabletop. It's not a retrospective analysis. It's an experience that the learners go through, and almost always it puts them into a situation that they would not have experienced otherwise. And we find it very powerful for all the reasons that Susan mentioned. So, thank you.
So, I'm Craig Hedberg, and I'm working on a project which is a little bit different. It's a retrospective analysis. So we're not actually doing any training within our project. We're trying to evaluate the impact of previous training on performance. And we've been looking at different groups of responders, some in settings where people have responded to flood situations, both seasonal floods that have occurred in some of our major river valleys, as well as flash floods associated with storm conditions, bridge collapse responders from the 35W bridge that went down several years ago, and then the area where I have the most familiarity is dealing with responders to foodborne outbreaks. And there's, everything, Susan, that you've said, strikes chords with me, and on a personal level, the first thing I can see is how far I have to improve my own teaching. But in terms of looking at responders, and in particular looking at our foodborne disease response system, there's a couple areas that are of particular importance, I think, from what you've said. And one is sort of the importance of prior knowledge and how we organize knowledge. And I think that actually becomes a huge barrier to changing the systems that we work with. So one of the things, as we've been evaluating how we respond to outbreaks and how we begin to try to develop better methods and methods that we can demonstrate are more effective, going back to people who have been trained to do something a certain way and see that as the way that you do things becomes very difficult, because they have this knowledge that this is how you should do that. They may have some of these superficial knowledge structures, and unfortunately we live in a really information-rich world in which it's really easy for people to reinforce those superficial knowledge structures by seeking out information that sort of reinforces their view of things rather than challenges their understanding of whether that is the appropriate knowledge structure. And I find myself, in my area of expertise is relatively limited, and as I approach other problems, I can see in myself some of those superficial knowledge structures that that develop, and there's a challenge that we, I think, all have to trying to break down those barriers of what sort of exists deep in our mind as to how we've been taught to do something, and to replace that with some new information and new approaches to doing things. And that sort of gets into the area of developing mastery and sort of this process of goal-directed practice. And in the response groups that we've been looking at, there are a lot of emergency responders where there are events that occur fairly predictably. So our, paramedics and people who are in ambulance crews, they go through these procedures frequently. There's frequent practice and observation that they can apply to their learning. But there's a lot of the types of events that we've been looking at that occur very infrequently. And you don't have the opportunity to reflect on your experience and how that relates to your practice. And so actually the foodborne disease world is one of those where we do have repeated outbreaks which actually serve as a tool to develop mastery and give us an opportunity for some of this goal-directed practice around developing better investigation methods and how we can get more efficiently to the outbreak. And the Minnesota Department of Health has actually developed a level of competence where I think they actually are in this unconscious competence arena with respect to outbreak investigations. And one of the tensions that we see as we look at the interrelationships between state and local agencies, state agencies, and our federal agencies in response is that the level of performance across our system really spans the spectrum of expertise. And so we have a lot of agencies that are in sort of this conscious competent mode. They have a sense for what they need to do, and it's very demanding for them to work through this system. And then there are, on the other end, agencies like Minnesota or the Oregon Department of Health where there is just this instinctive approach to dealing with things. And one of the issues that frequently we get into is that people who are sort of in this spectrum between conscious incompetence and conscious competence have a hard time sort of following the lead of the unconscious competence. And the unconscious competence frequently run out of patience for trying to, get people to follow these transitions. And, I think there's a lot of room to maneuver in there. And I think the point you made about sort of people who are so expert that they don't even pay attention to what they're doing, and making an effort to try to reclaim that memory of all of those steps you have to go through, I think is going to be very important to help them provide better guidance for people who are lower on the spectrum. And one of the things that is coming forward is the development of the, under the Food Safety Modernization Act, CDC is creating a series of centers of excellence in food safety, and Minnesota is one of those centers of excellence. And part of the task for the Minnesota and the other centers will be to help develop and help train others in these best practices. And so what you've showed us about sort of this, how we need to sort of step back and sort of reclaim sort of the consciousness of what we're doing, I think is going to be tremendously important for helping that process work more effectively.
Hi, I'm Colleen Monahan. Well, after Craig, I feel even more consciously incompetent. And I did. And the presentation was done, so I guess I'm going to have to face my confidence and competence to give this little presentation. Our study focused on the use of 3D virtual environments. We used a product called Second Life as a planning tool for emergency preparedness. And we worked with local health department staff across the country, about 24 health departments. And it was clearly an adult audience, so the principles described by Dr. Ambrose applied quite well. But because we used virtual worlds, we had a lot of conscious incompetence going on with the groups that we were working with. So I guess the approach I want to take in terms of my response is maybe not to talk as much about our project, but to talk about my interest, my special interest, in preparing for the next generation entering the workforce. Maybe this is because my mind's organizational structure fits probably more into cell D, more than cell D, more scattered than cell D, maybe a cell F. Maybe in your next book you can cover that. But research is showing that there are, for this next generation, there are mind alterations and cognitive changes caused by the new digital technologies, media, and games that the younger generation are involved with and spend the majority of their time in. And they essentially are developing what some people call hypertext minds. They leap around. It's as though their cognitive structures were parallel and not sequential. Dr. Ambrose discussed one type of organization as linear, which I think was in cell B. And this is the approach that most of us use for training adult learners. We did it in our study too, at least in our didactic sections. But the linear approach that dominates educational systems now can actually retard learning for the brains developed through game and web surfing. Processes where they focus on the computer all day. So my main point in my response is that we need to have a parallel effort to help prepare for the next generation of adult learners. I hope that the virtual worlds approach we took in our study will be followed up and improved upon by others, looking for methods to train the future hypertext thinking generation of emergency response learners. Joan?
I'm Joan Rombic, and I work on the Disaster 101 simulated disaster response scenarios. Following 9/11 and then following Katrina, most of the education that was going on for healthcare personnel was related to, or was related to professional education, kind of catching professionals up so that they'd be able to respond to what was clearly a changing world. And what we identified here at the university was we had 6 professional schools that also the concern and interest about emergency preparedness was rising for them. And for us to think about some ways that we could begin to prepare professional health science students to enter the workforce and not do all the preparation in silos, so that each school wasn't working alone trying to figure out a way to do this. And fortunately, this project came along, and we developed a Moodle course for health science students who signed up for this as an optional day experience. Moodle course that they could have 2 hours of preparation prior to coming to the day-long workshop, and then at the day-long workshop had smaller workshop sessions dealing with communication during an emergency response, including incident command, triage, how to begin to think about triage in some different ways other than just the ways that someone may experience that in an emergency room or in a clinic setting, and also scene safety, how to begin to look at your environment in some new ways. So that over the course of the past 4 years, we've had students come and have this day-long experience where they had these workshops, small workshops together after preparing with Moodle, and then experiencing a disaster simulation. We had 2 scenarios, and
students divided up into small groups. One scenario was a structural collapse where we had simulated victims, and the other scenario was a bomb blast. And I think that the focus of one of the important focuses, I think, or that we had was the opportunity for students to have practice. They experienced each simulation twice, going in, coming out, have a debrief, restructuring, thinking through what just happened and how could we have done this in a different way, in a better way, what are the things that we didn't expect to happen. And we had experts who gave them feedback as a group, and we also were surprised to find that students were giving each other feedback in a way that was constructive and supportive to each other. And at the end of all of 4 of their experiences, we again came together, gave feedback, and students also had the opportunity to hear from simulated victims, to hear what their experience was during the course of the day-long workshop. So practice and feedback was my word for the day. So happy to be here. Thank you.
I think, can I just say one thing? When I first was invited to come and I looked across all of the projects that I thought were so impressive, a lot of what you all just said really resonated. And the thing about them that struck me is that, you know, with all the learning research, we know that you learn what you practice. And you all were providing practice in as real a context as it can get, so that it ended up being incredibly relevant, which then is incredibly motivating to people, which then really triggers that whole sort of mastery kind of loop, you know, the whole learning loop. And I think that you heard that today, that very targeted practice in real life situations that people resonate with comes across, and I think that's probably a lot of the success that you've experienced.
Well, let's give a round of applause for all of our panelists. And thank you very much for those people who submitted questions. We have some very good questions. The first one I'm going to address to Dr. Ambrose, but other members of the panel, feel free to make comments. The question is, what of much was said assumes some knowledge of the students in a course? How would the instructor quickly gather information about student issues?
That's a good question. It's hard to give a generic response, but I'm going to try. In terms of really understanding students' knowledge base and skill set, the only way you really get at that, or the best way you really get at that, is to actually have them perform. So you give them a task to see what it is they can do. And the task can be short, it shouldn't be graded, it can be anonymous, but you give them a task to see whether or not your assumptions about what they know are accurate. And so that's the first and foremost. If you can do that, that is best. Being not able to do that, the next thing you can do is ask students, but as opposed to asking students, what do you know, you can give students, for example, a list of concepts, and you can say, for each concept, tell me, can you define it? Do you know when to use it? Do you know how to use it? You know, is it something you've seen, something you've used? If you've used it, how often? So you can ask particular questions that educate students, but that also differentiate those different levels of knowledge. And I would say that those are the two best ways to actually get at the knowledge base and skill set that students have. And then there are a variety of ways to really tap into the belief system around intelligence and learning, and I was hinting at how important that is, because people's beliefs about intelligence, about learning, are incredibly important. And there are some very nice inventories out there. I think the best inventory by a woman named Schomer that really gets at the epistemological beliefs that students hold about learning. So that if you find out that, you know, of all of your students, the majority of them really, because they've been successful, believe learning is quick and easy, then you better dispel that myth very quickly. And often people who've been successful all their lives, and this could be, undergraduates as well as the adult returning professionals, if they've been successful and things have come easy, they can really believe learning is easy. And if they get into a situation where it's not easy and they have to struggle, they may not persist. And so you can get at those kinds of things through, one-on-one interactions with students during office hours, or you can get at them by doing something like Schomer's inventory of epistemological beliefs.
Dr. Ambrose, can you spell that inventory? Because I think that's a very important, Schomer's.
Schomer, it's S-C-H-O-M-M-E-R, Marlene Schomer. You can get on the web and see you can find the inventory and see a lot of research that she's done on that.
Great. Does anybody else on the panel want to address how they might gain more information about how you find out about students' issues at the beginning of your exposure to the course?
I'll take a little stab at that. One tool that we used prior to our simulation was assessing people's confidence level and asking questions about how comfortable they felt in handling certain kinds of situations, and then collected that information again after the simulation itself and then months later as well.
Terrific. Okay, next question. How would you apply these principles to an online learning environment? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Well, one thing I will say about online learning environments is for those that are done well, you're often, and I'm going to stress for those that are done well, because I think there's a lot of junk out there, quite frankly. But for those that are done well, you're forced to be explicit. Excuse me. You're forced to be explicit about about a number of things. You're forced to be explicit about what it is you expect students to be able to do, because you're not going to be live having those discussions with them. You're often forced to be explicit about what your expectations are for assignments, which means that you're forced to be explicit about what it is it takes to do an assignment. So that kind of unconscious competence sometimes has to be thought through. And for the really well-done online courses, you have to plan all of it in advance, which is often not how professors work. Often professors are a week or 2 or 3 ahead of their students, and they can get away with it because, we are experts. But in an online situation, you often have to sit down and plan the whole thing in advance. So I think the explicitness that you have to do and the creation of the whole that is usually involved with really good online learning situations is a really positive thing, and it's something that's not done in the real on-site face-to-face.
Anybody want to say anything additional? Then I'd like to make a comment when you talk about online learning versus real learning. Our dental students were required to take Disaster 101, but we exceeded the capacity of the course, and so they had an option to do an online module. And I can tell you the difference between actually doing Disaster 101 with that whole scenario versus the online module was tremendous. And definitely the immersion in that real situation made a huge impact that just couldn't come across in an online module.
Okay, I'll add something.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think that oftentimes when people do that sort of thing, they say we're going to do an online alternative. It's basically they just throw up all the material and slides, and you just go through the slides. Yeah. You have to sort of, like we did in our study, we used a virtual environment. Well, they could have done the same thing there. Then you're basically doing a similar thing where you're immersed in it. Mm-hmm. But to throw slides up against something that was so active, the other really isn't fair. And I would say that part of the slam that online learning gets is because the instructors themselves don't really understand the technology well enough to teach online. They're just being pushed into it by their universities, because that's what the students want. And they need to probably be bringing in more people with expertise to know how to use the technology to really make it fully, rich.
Here. I want to second that, and that's what I meant by there was a lot of junk out there, and that was probably not the right word to use, but I think you're exactly right. People take what they've done in a classroom and put it up there, ignoring the context in some respects. And I think there are a lot of ways that you can do, using the technology, create those rich environments, but I would say 9/10 of what's out there, people aren't doing that. They're doing what you described.
Well, and I might add, too, that many universities are buying into systems like a Blackboard system that's forcing the teachers to put their stuff in little holes and doesn't add at all to the process of education. So, some of the best online instructors are now kind of trying to do their own thing off the university system. So it's really a shame. I mean, universities they still have not really embraced it in a real sense.
Good comments. Here's our next question. When you talk about culture influencing effort, do we change standards and goals for students who come out of a culture of poverty and poor secondary education? Do we lower standards for those who use poor grammar, punctuation, logic, plagiarism, use of citation, word choice, etc.?
Wow. No, I don't think we lower standards, and I think the research is clear that you can challenge students and give them a rigorous educational experience if you provide the support that they need to meet them wherever they are. And so I think there are two issues here. We have to be realistic about where they are, and we can't teach where we wish they would be. And I think with this generation of students coming in, many of you may have heard the phrase, they're much smarter, but they're less prepared. And if you look at, now I'm going to focus for 1 minute on undergraduates, but if you look at the amount of reading and the type of reading and the amount of writing and the type of writing they're doing in high schools, it's really clear. And the high schools, secondary ed, we all know, is being pushed for a variety of reasons to teach to tests. And they need to do that for their financial well-being. And a lot of, secondary high school teachers have gone on record saying that they know they're not teaching students the thinking process, problem-solving, critical thinking, because they're teaching to tests. So we're getting really smart students who are less prepared. So on the one hand, we have to meet them where they are. On the other hand, we have to push them as far beyond as we can. And so I think it's that balance of challenge and support. And if you're at institutions that provide, academic support, peer tutoring, study groups, remediation if students need remediation, we know that highly motivated learners, if they get that support, will rise to the challenge and then take off. But I think we can't ignore it, and we can't lower standards. If we lower standards, then we're going to end up, academically adrift. The book, some of you may have heard a popular book in the news, then we're going to end up educating students, undergraduates, who aren't really what we would consider educated, and pass along the problem to those of us who are then teaching, graduate students and adult returning professionals. So, that's a generic answer, because I think it depends on the context of your institution, depends on the context of your curriculum and where you're teaching in it. But no, I don't think we should lower standards. I think we need to maintain those standards and provide the education the students deserve, and especially when they come from, a secondary situation where they didn't get what they needed.
Great. Any other comments? Anybody want to make? Yeah.
I also just want to say that with a lot of the kids today, education, the way that it's being presented to them should probably be taught more like English as a second language. I think that given the forms of communication that a lot of the kids use on a regular basis to each other is not really acknowledged, and it's actually they put the kids down for that. So I think again, we have to get more real about the way these kids think and the way they communicate, and then make the education either more relevant to them or teach it like an acting class, where they have to understand that there's these things that they need to accomplish in order to succeed in these XYZ, but not necessarily, demean them for the way they currently communicate socially.
But I do think, Colleen and I can go back and forth here, I do think they need to understand, and I'll talk as a historian for a minute, that no matter how good you are in twittering, you're not going to put together a historical argument using evidence that, that will create a convincing argument for people. I mean, so I think you're right. They need to understand that there are different conventions in different respects, and so socially there are things, ways that you would communicate that are fine and make sense, and then, there are other conventions that you have to learn. If you're writing, again, a policy paper, a memo for someone, a historical argument, whatever, a lab report. And I think that, this comes back to the explicitness, where we need to recognize how they're thinking and where they're spending their time. And we need to, I'm not so sure that we need to leverage that. I think if we can find ways to leverage that, that's great. But I also think that we need to just be explicit about the kinds of communication that students, for example, need to learn. So I will tell my students that I don't want them sending me an email unless they use capital letters and punctuation, because I think it's important that they learn, to communicate in some standard accepted ways of English. And if they send that to me and it's written like Twitter with, not full words, I send it back. And that's a personal decision I make, because I think that, and I take what you say, Colleen, to heart. I have kids who, use all of the Twitter, Facebook, and I don't want to put them down for that, but I want to be explicit, not only that I'm not accepting that in my academic courses, but why, so that they understand, again, that there are different, things that are acceptable in different situations. And I don't think we take time to explain that to them. I think we just say, no, that's bad, and we're judgmental, and then I think that, lessens the communication and the conversation we should be having with them.
Well, I'll go back to what I said before, which I think is, again, kind of promoting linear thinking. I mean, I think we're talking about a generation that leaps around. So the very thing you're criticizing them for is that leap. Mm-hmm. And I might say that, our last president got elected primarily because of a lot of the Twitter activity that was going on the net. And so to say people can't have, really in-depth arguments using abbreviated language is, I think you have to look at what happened in the last presidential campaign.
But what I'm talking, we don't have to go. I mean, what I'm talking about is we can disagree on this. Yeah, I think it's very hard in 144 characters to really get across something really very in-depth, and I think it's easier to, make certain kinds of communication pieces that, when put together, might, loosely be called an argument. But I think we're just going to disagree on that.
Right. Well, I think there's sort of a cultural context here that, you were talking about the informality of teaching in America, and I think America in a lot of ways has just become totally informal in sort of the way we behave generally, and so I think there isn't sort of a frame of reference always for when formality is appropriate and when they need to engage their sense of formality to to interact and to put context around writing and reading assignments. And so, that's an issue that has been discussed within the School of Public Health, that, we need to be doing more about teaching students how to behave professionally. And sort of what you're describing of interacting with students in the classroom, I think, is part of that.
Great discussion. I'd like to take a step back, because we've gotten a question from somebody on our that's watching us via the internet, and they would like to know just a few sentences about what makes a good online training session. So we spent some time talking about that. So from a panel of experts, can you just give us some ideas and short vignettes of what a good online training session would be? Colleen, I know you're dying to answer.
Well, I think that an online training session a good online training session isn't any different than a good face-to-face training session. If, again, if you're just replacing someone who's lecturing, and then the students write frantically and then leave at the end of the class, then, PowerPoint slides and online probably just are exactly the same thing. So I think a lot of interactivity, a lot of opportunity to, provide some feedback. It's harder to do if the instructor's not, if it's on a live presentation, but, again, I think a really good training session is a good training session, whether it's online or face-to-face.
Any other comments?
Well, I think the idea of mastery and having the ability to perform exercises and you get feedback, you can actually do that very nicely in an online setting in ways that might actually be easier and better than in a classroom setting. It takes a lot of work up front to build those, but I think that can actually be quite an attractive feature of an online course as well.
I'll just share that we're in the process of developing with the university, as a result of our grant, some online courses for incident management for the roles in the ICS structure. So those will be coming out soon. So you can watch for those, and they'll be promoted as well. So
I just wanted to add to what Craig said, and part of the reason why I think that interactivity can be even better online is because the students aren't necessarily so self-conscious. Like in a face-to-face class, they might have to speak out, and their peers may not like what they have to say, but online they can just type it out and not have to worry about it as much.
I can make a couple comments with respect to the online learning, and it reflects back to the earlier discussion about it. First of all, Susan, I think it goes to your principle number 4, which is feedback. That feedback is a very important aspect of learning, and I agree with that. And so there needs to be the practice according to your principle, and then the feedback after that. And in my experience in online learning, the learners get much more feedback than they ever do from me in a classroom, because it's by virtue because it is so impersonal and it's asynchronous. So I make sure that they know what they need to do, and then after they do it, I give feedback on what they've done. And I also agree that there are some courses that are not ideal. That's our fault. If a faculty puts a course online that isn't meeting the needs of the learners as outlined by, for example, your 7 principles, then that's faculty's fault. It's not the fault of an online course, and that should be addressed with that faculty. With respect to there's an implicit assumption that a classroom course we learn and it's better, and an online course we don't learn, and therefore it's inferior. I haven't seen any evidence that that's true. I happen to believe that I'm more effective in a classroom than I am online, but I've done a lot of research on the competencies that the learners get, whether the same course, whether it's online or in the classroom, and they're the same, and sometimes the online is better as far as the outcomes. So I don't know what the answer is, but I do know that the questions need to be asked in a way that results in a fair answer rather than an answer that's not based on facts or based on evidence.
Right.
Yeah, I'll go back just to what Colleen said and say it at a kind of broader level or higher level. She started by saying it shouldn't be any different. And the questions you ask as you design them are exactly the same. Who are the students? What do they know? What do I want to accomplish? What are the constraints that I have? How much practice will I give them in what areas? How quickly will I give them feedback? What kinds of feedback? And so it's the exact same kinds of questions. And I think it is true that online lends itself to the practice and feedback much better because it can be quicker feedback, more timely when students need it, as opposed to waiting while you grade something a week later, giving it back.
Great, thank you. The next question is, how can teachers influence students' level of motivation?
Well, instead of me starting, actually, since you're dealing with adult learners, why do you think what you all have done have gotten the responses that you've gotten? What was it about what you did that for the adult learners really resonated? Because I talked about expectancy of success and value relevancy, their pragmatism.
Sure. I'll start and then you can add comment, Bill. I guess for us, how we motivated them was by creating success. While Bill talked about us adding stressors and creating them to behave in certain ways, we did do feedback with them. We incorporated that concept of individual coaching so that we allowed them to succeed. And that, for the type of professionals we have, some people were not wanting to come because they didn't know it as well as they thought they should know it. And so we had some of that kind of concept and they're excellent professionals in what they do, and so that's a very hard concept to not be successful. And so when we started doing that coaching model, it really allowed them then to perform better, which increased their comfort level and increased their motivation to participate. We had one person who made a comment after being in multiple exercises about, I used to come and I was so afraid I would spend a half an hour just paralyzed and not able to do anything, and now I come in here and I'm excited when we're going to do an exercise. So, to me, that kind of flip is what made it for us.
So that is, just absolutely on target in terms of the research, that if you give somebody a little bit of success, even on a tiny task, it builds their confidence. When it builds their confidence, they engage, which builds their competence, which then starts that loop. And so I think we can do that in any kind of learning situation. No matter how bad a performance someone may have on a task, a paper, a project, if you can find something small they've been successful at and focus on that first so that they can feel and understand what success is, then it allows that loop to happen. So I think that's really smart.
Yeah, and it fit in actually with your conversation about the standards and you adjust your standards. And there were people who thought we should make things easier, and it was an internal battle of, no, we don't want to make it easier, but what can we do to help them succeed? And that's where we came in with that concept of coaching.
Other comments? I have to say that when I watched the first Disaster 101, my motivation went really sky high. Because you have experts who responded, and I remember at the beginning they were showing pictures from the bridge falling down, from 9/11, all of these examples, and talking about things that could happen, and I just got really motivated. I wanted to go in there with my students and do this because I thought, there's a lot to this. It made a lot of sense to me, and so the relevance was really well done I think in the Disaster 101.
And I would say for people who, don't have the luxury really of having Second Life or simulations or whatever, in the good old days, people would use things like case studies, which is really big in business schools or in engineering. And in engineering, you use failures, a bridge falling down, the windows coming out of the Hancock building, whatever it is. And the reason students in business schools and in engineering and other places, architecture, always found case studies motivating is because they were real life stories. And so the fact that they were real life a context, not some made-up context. Now, in everybody's discipline, it may not be as easy to do that. And the fact that they were stories. So the other thing we should say is that case studies are really valuable because, and this is a cross-cultural thing, in every culture, people learn by stories in one way or the other. And so it's kind of creating that context, that relationship, that this is something that happened to people, with people, as a result of people, is really important. So you can do it as low-tech, as a story, and as high-tech as, the Second Life.
Okay, we have one last question. I have time for one last question. And you mentioned adults want control. How do educators give adult learners more control and autonomy in a learning environment? So,
again, I'll answer it generically and then see how people did it. But for example, in traditional courses, and I have not myself taught online, so I can't speak to that. But I don't see why it would be any different. In traditional courses, you might give people choices, for example, about a topic that they want to do a special presentation on. Or you might give them choices of the kinds of activities that they will participate in. And there are pros and cons to all of these, and there's not time to go into it. But so you could have a series of activities, and it may be a written paper, it may be a presentation, it might be something else. But you actually give them choice in how they're going to show the learning that went on. Or, depending on how a course is set up, you may actually give them choice in the kinds of things that they want to learn. So in some respects, it's about choices. But having said that, I think you need to think very carefully, and these are the kind of pros and cons, that you don't want people only always playing to their strengths. Because if people always play to their strengths, then they're not, pushing themselves or broadening themselves. And so, inherent in that choice, right, is those kinds of issues. And what I found, what big difference between graduate and undergraduate students is the undergraduates often, because of who they are and the level, the sort of immaturity, if you will want to play to their strengths. Often adults understand that, I need to stretch, I need to go in a new direction, I need to broaden. So even though there's that angst about I'm a successful professional and I want to be successful, you'll find that if you provide maybe some of that, support that will make it safe for them to fail or to take risks. I mean, we talked about the importance of success in learning, but there's also the importance of failure in learning. But you've got to have a certain level of confidence to fail at something and then seek help to get it better.
And I guess I would have nothing really in particular to add. I would concur that we did give people choices in our setting. We got feedback continually. If we incorporated it, we let them know. If we didn't, we told them why, because there were things that people gave us as feedback that, we simply would have tainted things or weren't real world for how the agency would respond. And then also, as follow-up to our research, we're now doing sessions where we're bringing people in and they're looking at the framework of the response role they had, and they're providing the feedback of what is most helpful for them in utilizing those tools. So again, we're continuing to do that long term.
Great. Well, thank you so much, the panel of experts. Let's give them another round of applause. Now we thank everybody for attending and participating. Be sure and fill out the evaluation form and let us know about your experiences. And I'd like to thank everybody that was involved to make this happen today, which is the AHC Office of Education, the Association of Deans for Education, and the School of Public Health Futures Committee for Lifelong Learning. If you're interested, Dr. Ambrose's new book, How Learning Works, is available in the bookstore downstairs. So thank you again for attending the Teaching and Learning series today. Thanks very much.